hope you're still awake and with me here. Welcome to another exciting edition of San Diego Ruby User Group, whatever. I'm going to give kind of a short talk on using C in Ruby using Ruby Inline. Ruby Inline is useful for a lot of reasons. You'll see stuff on the internet about using it for performance optimization. It's good if you want to yank out a slow method you've got implemented in Ruby and replace it with nice sizzling hot C. Good for integrating with legacy code and tools and libraries written in other languages. So I say it's a short talk because really the only point I want to drive home is, yes, it really is that easy. There's really good documentation examples online, and when I was first looking at them, I'd seen a couple articles, and it's like 5 or 10 lines of code, and so kind of half thought to myself, there's got to be a catch in there somewhere, so I'm just going to procrastinate this till I really need it. For example, here's the sample code right off the Ruby Inline website, and you can see it's a class with a method written in Ruby and a method written in C, sort of. And we'll break that down in a little bit. But yeah, it's really easy and it's really powerful. But before we get too much into it, a wise man once said that with great power comes great responsibility. And besides the fact that I'm seeing Spider-Man 3 tonight, midnight showing, sweet. Before we get too crazy about optimizing our C specifically, or optimizing our Ruby with C, I should say, you need to remember that before you start yanking out code and replacing it with stuff that you feel like is going to make it faster, that sort of thing starts with, good benchmarking, profiling, and statistics. So don't be too rash lest you suffer the consequences. That being said, I'm going to talk a little bit about a small application I wrote a couple weeks ago to generate passwords using a clever little algorithm called Diceware, which is basically just a huge word list, and you roll dice and pick words, and it's pretty good way of generating passwords, and it's pretty good memorable stuff. So I'm just going to actually walk through that, a little bit of a live demo. If I can wrestle with my display settings again for a second. I'll show you, basically I'm going to write that right in front of you guys because it really did turn into one of those literally only 10 lines of code sort of situations. So here we are back at my desktop. I will pull up the right directory. Let's make this bigger so you guys can read it. Let's just open up this directory in TextMate, and I'll show you, for example, here's the file in C that I downloaded from the Diceware website. They provided their entire word list in just a huge array in C, and just a method to access it. So rather than text parse all this stuff into a Ruby source file and build it into a Ruby array, I figured, hey, this is a great time to finally dust off some Ruby integration with C and figure out how that works. My first instinct was to write a module that actually created a Ruby class in C that I could then call, but that turned out to be a bit of a pain compared to this approach, which turns out to be really simple. So here we are in a Ruby source file. I'll make the text bigger for you guys. Module Diceware class word list, and we're going to call a method provided by Ruby Inline called inline. And all I've done up to this point, you can see I'm requiring the inline gem, and I ran gem install Ruby Inline from the command line, which I trust you guys can figure that part out too. So we're going to call a method from inline, and we give it and it gives us an object, a object which they call builder. And this builder, really the trivial case is that you just call builder.c and give it a string. And that string is just a C function. So in this case, we want a string. So that'll be a char star. And we'll call this method get. Because this is going to create a public instance method on the word list class. I mean, whether you can do static methods and whatnot, I haven't spent the time to figure it out yet. But we're basically going to give it an integer, get back a string. And Ruby Inline handles the type conversion automatically for you. It does some parsing and has some wrapper functions to create the Ruby objects the way that you'd expect them from the various sort of atomic C data types, if you will. So really all we're doing here is we're calling that get Diceware function that was at the bottom of this over here with that integer that we're providing. And that's kind of it. It's not quite it because Ruby Inline can't read your mind. You need to tell it where to find other source files if you're calling other functions. So builder also has an include method, and you can just give it the, well, I would say just, but for example, if you're including a system file, you still need to have little angle brackets and call your libraries or whatever. So you actually need to include the quote marks and whatever. And in this case, we're calling the Diceware 8k.c file. And because all the compiling and stuff goes on in another directory, I need to give it the absolute path, which I'm just going to copy from my working version of this source over here. So basically, this is it. If we call this method get, all that's left from this point is to build an interface around it to call this method. And for that, I'm just going to grab my sort of finished and working version, which doesn't really have too much of an interface. I just created a class method on the Diceware module that instantiates one of these word list objects and calls that get method with an integer. And because Diceware is based on rolling dice, I roll a handful of dice, or simulate rolling a handful of dice, and output the words associated with that. So I'm just going to run this on the command line to show you that it works. So there we go. Some random words. Oh, that's a -1. That's weird. So there might still be bugs, but as you can see here, it's pulling words out of that list, which we saw were in this huge C array. So it's pretty fun and actually really intuitive to use this, especially if you're calling library methods that are already written for you, or if you're writing sort of standalone C to crunch numbers quickly and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's basically the meat of my presentation. It really is that easy. Diceware handles a lot of the stressful parts of turning this into C and building Ruby objects and linking and all that kind of stuff. If you ever want to poke around with the source that it builds, it keeps it in the .ruby inline directory in your home directory. And in this case, we have Diceware word list such and such .c, which I guess I'll open and show you guys. So it handles all the, include ruby.h, and this is the include that I gave it with the path to my C file, and here's where it creates that method where it's actually creating something that using ruby.h to attach later on to the class and the module and whatnot. And I don't have a whole lot of experience in building Ruby C extensions, but this could even conceivably be a good way to hack around and learn a little bit more about that too. So that's basically it. I'll pull my presentation up again So you can see a list of links to this stuff. Ruby Inline, Diceware, it's also pretty easy to Google these things. And yeah, so now go ahead and go call some C libraries. So any questions? Question? Memory management? I think that comes from the ruby.h stuff. Yeah.
For the Ruby garbage collector dispose of, the C library is treated like a normal Ruby class then?
I'm really not too familiar with the technical. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that I like about Ruby Inline is I don't really have to think about that because I haven't written C in like 4 or 5 years, you know, so that's why I write Ruby now. Yeah, it's a good question though. Did you have a question too? No? Someone else? Okay. Other questions? Sweet, so I guess that means next month we'll have a writing Ruby modules in C part 2. Go for it.
Thanks for the Diceware link.
Yeah, it's fun. I might be presenting on that a little bit more in the future because that's my sort of side project, teach myself how to write a gem, command line sort of application that might be useful. So you may see more of that in the future. Cool. Next.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.